Chapter 29. His Fear. The fourth level, Dread's Keep. The bottom of Crinan's boot thumped against the ground beneath him as he took his first step into Dread's Keep. Echoes of his footfalls reverberated into what could have been an endless hallway, though it was much too dark for Crinan to know where he stood. The door to the keep shut behind him, and Crinan found himself breathless under the pressure of the suffocating silence. "Hello," Crinan called out, expecting any of the members of his group to respond. He, however, received no reply. He spun in place for a moment, searching for someone, anyone, but it seemed they were all gone. "Well, shit," Crinan grumbled. He could feel his heart thumping in his chest as he anxiously began to walk forward. He couldn't see a floor or any walls, but his steps continued to echo all around him. "Sage?" Crinan whispered. "Lucas?" Again, no response. "Is anyone fucking there?" Silence. Another step, and Crinan moved deeper into the pitch-black heap. Then another, and he began to wonder how far he could walk before he ran into something. It was a keep. There had to have been an end to it. Perhaps some furniture, a table or a chair somewhere. But then Crinan remembered he wasn't in Duran. He was in the Hells, and nothing in the Hells was as it should be. Crinan heard the sound of movement, a strange skittering across the floor, and then a small breathy laugh. He anxiously pulled his gun free in response, stopping and spinning in place. He held his weapon out in front of him, but something was wrong. The handle wasn't hard like it was supposed to be. It was warm, soft, fuzzy. A sudden screech, and then the sound of wings flapping caused Crinan to jump back and throw whatever was in his hand. Whatever it had been, a bat it had felt like, flew away. Crinan cursed and grit his teeth together. He was being fucked with, and he did not like it. Crinan breathed rapidly, and his heart thumped in his chest. He wanted to turn around and just go fight and die with the other Black Knights outside, but he no longer knew which way the door was. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't hear anything. For all he knew, he no longer even existed. "Hello?" Crinan yelled, looking all around for any sign of light. "Somebody!" Silence. Crinan started to walk again. He walked in whatever direction he was facing, slowly and carefully at first. He tried to be patient. He held his hands in front of him, feeling for any kind of obstacle, waiting for a wall that should have come, but it didn't. He kept going, his feet moving a little faster, his patience wavering, but he could not find the wall. He could not find an end. After what had to have been at least 10 minutes of blind wandering, Crinan broke into a sprint. He ran, flailing his arms about, hoping that his fingers would brush against something. He pushed himself harder, to go faster. He didn't care if he ran face first into the wall at that point. He simply wanted to find it. He needed to find something other than himself. "Run!" A voice he didn't recognize called out to him. He stopped and looked around, hoping to find the owner of the voice, but it was too dark. "Where are you?" Crinan yelled, reaching his hands out again. "Come to me!" "Run!" the voice repeated, slightly more aggressively. One by one, additional voices from all around him repeated the same word. "Run! Run! Run!" It became a chant, almost tribal in nature as the voices culminated into one. Crinan's nostrils flared, and he pulled his second pistol free. This time the handle was as it was supposed to be, and as soon as he heard another voice shout at him, he lifted his weapon and fired. For a split second, the flash from the muzzle illuminated the area. He saw melted, emaciated faces, gray and elongated, with mouths open and black holes where their eyes were supposed to be. Long fingers with sharp nails reached for him. They wanted him. They wanted to dig into him and rip as they distributed chunks of him to each other. Crinan gasped and fell to his knees, covering his head with his hands as he waited for the attack, but none came. He clenched his teeth together and panted through his nose, waiting, and nothing happened to him. Silence. After a few minutes, Crinan stood. He reached out, feeling for whatever had surrounded him, but he felt nothing. No people, no creatures, nothing. The sound of his breathing filled his ears. The pounding of his heart shook his body. Crinan slowly spun in place as he waited for something to happen. Something had to happen eventually. "What's that?" he asked, looking around. "That phone?" "What's going on?" he finally shouted, stomping his foot in fury. The ringing stopped, and a female voice spoke.
"Who is this? Hello?"
Crinan's heart sank. He felt the hair on his arms stand straight up, and his lower lip quivered as he listened to the voice. "Mom?" Crinan asked, not believing what he was hearing.
"Ruban?"
Crinan's mother asked.
"Ruban, why are you crying?"
"No!" Crinan shouted. "Not Ruban. It's me, Mama!" Crinan heard nothing. His mother did not respond. "Mama, please!" Crinan continued. "Are you there?"
"Who is this?"
A different voice demanded. He sounded angry, fiercely angry.
"What do you want?"
"Dad!" Crinan shouted. "It's me! It's Crinan!"
"Crinan is dead,"
his father shouted.
"I don't know what kind of sick fucking—"
"No! It's me! I made the bench with you. My name is carved on the bottom. Mine and Ruby's." Silence. "Dad, please," Crinan begged. "Dad, before I left for Camelot, you told me not to get anyone pregnant. When you found me in Malinka, you hugged me and you said you thought you lost me, that you loved me." Crinan heard the sound of sniffling on the other end of the line.
"You're dead,"
his father whispered.
"How?"
"I'm dead," Crinan replied. "I'm in the fucking hells, Dad. I'm—"
"Crinan,"
his father finally whispered.
"Crinan, my son, is it truly you?"
"Dad, it's me," Crinan repeated.
"You're not dead,"
his father said, his voice breaking into a chuckle. "What?" Crinan asked.
"You never existed. You are a piece of unwanted fucking garbage,"
his father replied in an amused tone.
"You were a mistake. You've always been a mistake. Don't entertain the idea that I ever loved you. You're nothing."
"Dad, stop it," Crinan whispered.
"You're no son of mine."
At that, the call abruptly ended, and Crinan curled his lip into a scowl. Tears fell down his cheeks, and he clenched his hands in fury.
"Breathe, Crinan."
He heard the soothing voice of his friend Alia echo in his mind.
"It's okay. Just breathe."
Crinan focused on the voice, took a breath in through his nose, and then let it out through his mouth. He closed his eyes, though it was already dark, and tried to center himself as Alia had taught him.
"You're strong. You're enough."
The memory of her voice continued. Crinan nodded his head as he felt some of the stress lift off of him.
"You're going to die."
Crinan's eyes shot open. He gasped and then took off running again. He didn't know which direction he was going, and in the darkness he wasn't sure that direction even existed anymore. He simply ran, pleading with the darkness for an exit, begging for a glimmer of hope. After what could have been minutes, or what could have been days, Crinan finally stopped. He was panting, sweating, and he felt like if his heart beat any faster it would burst. He bent over, resting his palms on his thighs, and simply breathed. "Think, Crinan," he told himself. "Think. There has to be a way out. Get fucking control over yourself. You can do this." The silence was broken by the sound of fire. Well, the sound of wood crackling in a fire. Quickly, Crinan spun around toward the direction of the sound and saw a soft, flickering orange light in the distance. Without a single word or another thought, Crinan ran toward the fire. The flames tugged at him as if he were a moth. He knew that danger would most likely meet him at the light, but the allure of it was too strong. He wanted it. No, he yearned for it. In his mind there was nothing other than himself and the light, and he resolved to merge the two into one. He ran without ceasing. He didn't even breathe until he reminded himself to do so. He ran for days, weeks, months. He knew neither the duration nor the distance that he ran, only that he did. A lifetime, or perhaps only a moment later, Crinan stopped. He reached up to scratch his face, and his fingers pressed against the coarse hairs of a beard. With both hands, he felt the edges of the thick, bushy hair that hung down his chest, and he gasped. "How long?" he whispered. "How long has it been?" Crinan's mind had never been further from himself. He barely grasped onto the idea of who or where he was. He knew only darkness, only fear, only desired to find the light. Yet none of it seemed real, for the only thing that Crinan was fully convinced that existed was nothing. Crinan stared at the fire, no larger than the eye of a needle now. He watched the flame that had once flickered brightly shrink as if it were being carried further away. Crinan blinked, and the flame turned to a coal, and then it was nothing. Silence. Darkness. Crinan. For a moment, Crinan stood and stared at the place where the light had been. It was no more. He had run for so long, fought for so long for the idea of something that had simply vanished. Crinan felt cheated. He felt angry. He wanted that light. He deserved that light. Why would the light go away after he had pursued it so fervently? He was suddenly lost. He felt hopeless. The light was gone. Had it ever existed? Had he ever existed? Did anything exist? Crinan felt an incredible weight on his shoulders, and with a sigh, he sat down. The ground was neither hot nor cold, neither soft nor hard. It was there, but it wasn't. Crinan did not know what he sat upon, and while every fiber of his being cared, he also could not have cared less. It was time for everything to end. He knew it. He wanted it. Nothing mattered anymore. The light was gone, and so was he, if he even existed in the first place. Crinan stretched his arms behind him and leaned back. He raised his head to the blackened sky above him and closed his eyes. He tried to envision something that would bring him comfort, but he only heard screaming in his mind. A tempest that swirled in his head and then flushed down his throat and into his heart. Crinan felt it. It burned hotter than any heat he had ever experienced. It swelled within him. It waged war against his chest, promising to tear him apart. And then a small voice broke through the storm. It confused Crinan. It drove the screaming away. The pain lifted, and he felt like he was finally able to breathe again.
Is this love?
The voice of Malinka echoed in his mind. They were children again. He felt her clinging to his arm with her head resting on his shoulder.
Is it, Crinan?
I don't know. He mouthed the words as they played in his mind. He was young, nervous, more afraid than he had ever been in his life. I think so.
Can I say it?
Malinka asked. The fear that churned in Crinan's heart as he and Malinka sat under the Camlosian night sky was unlike anything that he would ever experience again. The fear of being loved. Love. A power greater than what the hells could pile upon his shoulders. a force that had delivered a fear into young Crinan's heart that would never be matched again. He had experienced it before, and at the time the boy didn't realize how powerful his love truly made him. Young Crinan turned and pressed his forehead against the side of Malinka's. His lips brushed against her ear, and he felt the hair on his arms rise. He bit his lip as if to keep himself from talking, but a greater power inside him willed the words. "Say it," he whispered. He conveyed his desire passionately, desperately even. He wanted to hear her say the words. He wanted to share his love with the girl. His mind begged for it. His heart screamed for her to say it.
I love you, Crinan.
Crinan growled as the power flooded through him. He grunted as he pushed himself off the ground, and within moments his sword was in hand. The light wasn't gone. It had always been there. He simply refused to see it. He did exist. It was all real. "Come on!" Crinan challenged as he spun in place. He had never yelled so loudly in his life. He had never felt as confident as he did in that moment. He was his own. He would get through this. He would break the hells. He would save Malinka. The sounds of chains sliding and rattling across the ground filled Crinan's ears, and before he could respond, cold, rusted metal wrapped around him. It spun and squeezed as it encased his body, ripping away his armor and clothing and casting the shreds aside. Crinan screamed as the chains tore through his flesh as they migrated to his wrists and ankles. They pulled on him, stretching his extremities as his body was lifted into the air.
"Dread!"
A deep guttural voice echoed throughout the darkness.
"Fear. I can taste it. I can feel your fear."
The world around him exploded and burst into flames, and Crinan screamed in agony as shards of solid darkness tore through him. The fire cascaded over his body like a wind, scorching his exposed flesh and cooking him inside and out. The light revealed thousands, no, millions of the gray-skinned demons that he had seen before. They surrounded him. They reached for him and screamed his name with hungry voices. The fire coalesced into a spinning vortex in front of him, and the demons silenced. The low rumbling of the inferno filled the area, and Crinan could do nothing but watch as a great and powerful demon stepped out of the vortex, threw its head back, and roared.
"Thornscale!"
The small demons cried out before falling to their knees and lifting their arms in worship. They bowed down, faces flat on the burning ground, and Crinan watched as one by one their bodies were ripped apart and pulled into the vortex. The pull was intense, and Crinan felt his own blood being ripped from his body as Thornscale approached him.
"Speak your fear."
Thornscale commanded as he reached out and touched the muscles of Crinan's cheek with the tip of one of his long, pointed claws. The creature was gigantic, standing at least 40 feet tall. His body was muscular and throbbed as blood and magma burped from the spaces between his scales. "You," Crinan whimpered as he tried to pull his face away from the demon. "You already know my fears."
"Manifest them,"
Thornscale ordered. He lowered his head so that he was level with Crinan's gaze. The demon's eyes glowed red, and tongues of fire forked out of the top as they swirled and raged. I don't know what to say," Crinan yelled, realizing he was nothing before the creature. "I don't know how."
"Speak."
Thornscale continued. His tone was calm, but Crinan felt that the magnitude of Thornscale's voice could have leveled an entire city. Crinan was screaming. The pain he was enduring was overwhelming, but something told him he had to do this. He had to speak his fears. "I fear."
"Yes."
Thornscale encouraged.
"Speak it. Realize it."
"I fear death," Crinan shouted. "I don't want not to live.
"Deeper!"
Thornscale ordered.
"Something greater tears at your heart. It torments you in the night. It keeps you awake. Speak your fear, child.
Crinan only knew of one thing that kept him awake at night. It wasn't death. It wasn't subjugation. It was her.
Speak!
Thornscale boomed.
Manifest that which plagues your heart.
I fear her love, Crinan roared. I fear giving my love. I'm terrified I'm not enough for her, for anyone. He lowered his head and wept. Thornscale laughed a low rumble of a laugh and took a world-shaking step backward. He turned, reaching his massive hand into the fire tornado that raged behind him, and then pulled it back out.
The time has come to face your fear,
Thornscale instructed. His hand was clenched, and he raised it up so that Crinan could see what he held. Squirming in Thornscale's fist was Malinka. She fought and screamed as she was brought before Crinan, and Crinan's eyes grew wide. "No!" Crinan yelled. "Let her go!"
She will be released,
Thornscale replied flatly.
when you face your fear.
Crinan's mind raced, and he looked at the terrified girl in front of him. He knew what he had to do, and fear couldn't get in his way. "Malinka!" Crinan yelled. "Malinka!" Malinka stopped fighting and looked at Crinan. Her eyes were bloodshot, and she was breathing heavily. "It will be okay," Crinan promised. "It's all going to be okay."
Speak your fear,
Thornscale ordered. "Malinka!" Crinan's voice cracked, and he began to sob.
Say it! Say the words, Crinan.
"I love you, Malinka!" Crinan roared. Spittle flew from his mouth, and tears streamed from his eyes. "I always have! I'm sorry! I do love you!" At that, Thornscale threw his head back and laughed toward the sky. He squeezed the hand that held Malinka tight, and Crinan heard the bones within her body crunch. Blood poured from her eyes, nose, and mouth, and the skin on her face started to crack as her insides were pushed up through her throat and into her head. "No!" Crinan screamed. "No! Malinka!"
it is done.
Thornscale said. He threw Malinka's lifeless body into the hordes of demons, and they pounced on her, ripping away at her flesh.
Fear.
Thornscale reached out and grabbed Crinan's body. He pulled on him, breaking the chains that held him, and then spun and thrust his hand out at the fire vortex.
Burn away, little elf,
Thornscale whispered. The fire slammed against his body like a rock slide. He felt himself turning to ash and blowing away. And then, finally, there was nothing. Silence. Darkness. It was over.